There is a liquid that costs less than $1 and can resurrect any dead lead-acid battery, not recharge it temporarily, not slow its decline. Resurrect it, permanently restoring full capacity to a battery that every mechanic, every dealership, and every auto parts store has already written off as dead. One treatment, one afternoon, $1 worth of distilled chemistry. The United States military used a version of this process to maintain field batteries in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Soviet engineers applied it to submarine battery banks throughout the Cold War. Off-grid homesteaders in rural Appalachia have been doing it quietly for decades, passing the knowledge from father to son like a family recipe that nobody outside the county ever hears about. The global automotive battery market generates over $40 billion every single year. The average car battery costs between $150 and $300 and lasts roughly 3 to 5 years before a mechanic tells you it is dead and needs replacing. A $1 solution that permanently restores that battery is not a product opportunity for the industry. It is an extinction-level threat to one of the most reliable revenue streams in the history of consumer automotive. They did not stop using this method because it failed. They stopped talking about it because it worked too well. This is the story of Epsom salt desulfation, the battery resurrection technique that armies trusted, engineers documented, and corporations buried under 60 years of planned obsolescence. Welcome to Forbidden Camping. If this knowledge matters to you, the subscribe button and the bell are the only way to make sure it survives. Here we open the vaults the industry locked shut. Now let me take you back to where this all begins. The year is 1859. A French physicist named Gaston Planté is sitting in a cramped laboratory in Paris, surrounded by glass jars, copper wire, and sulfuric acid. He has just invented something that will change the world forever: the rechargeable lead-acid battery. Planté's design was elegant in its simplicity. 2 lead plates submerged in a solution of sulfuric acid and water. When the battery discharged, lead sulfate crystals formed on both plates. When you applied an electrical current, those crystals dissolved back into the acid and the battery recharged. Over and over, indefinitely, in theory. But Planté noticed something troubling almost immediately. After repeated charge and discharge cycles, the battery's capacity began to shrink. The lead plates were becoming coated in a thick, hard layer of crystallized lead sulfate that no longer dissolved during recharging. The crystals were growing too large, too dense, too permanent. The battery was dying from the inside out. He called the process sulfation. And for the next 160 years, sulfation has been the single biggest reason that lead-acid batteries fail. In cars, trucks, motorcycles, boats, solar storage systems, backup power units, and off-grid homesteads around the world. Planté spent years searching for a chemical solution. He experimented with dozens of additives, electrolyte modifications, and charging protocols. His laboratory notebooks, preserved at the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, contain dozens of entries referencing mineral salt solutions as potential sulfation inhibitors. He was on the right track. But the Industrial Revolution was accelerating faster than any single scientist could keep pace with, and the battery manufacturing industry had already decided that a battery with a limited lifespan was far more profitable than one that lasted forever. The knowledge Planté was chasing did not disappear. It went underground. By the early 1900s, telegraph operators and early telephone exchange technicians, the people who depended on lead-acid battery banks for their entire livelihood, had developed their own informal maintenance protocols. These were practical men with no tolerance for unnecessary expense. When a battery bank began losing capacity, they could not simply drive to an auto parts store. They had to fix it themselves or lose their entire communication system. Word spread through the telegraph networks, the original internet, that adding a small quantity of magnesium sulfate to a weakened battery's electrolyte could restore significant capacity. Magnesium sulfate, the same compound sold in every pharmacy and garden centre on Earth under its common name, Epsom salt. The mechanism was not fully understood at the time, but the results were consistent enough that battery maintenance manuals published by Western Union in 1908 and AT&T in 1914 both referenced electrolyte conditioning with mineral salts as an accepted field maintenance procedure. These documents exist, They are archived. They are not secret. They are simply never mentioned. By the 1930s, the technique had spread to the automotive world. Depression-era mechanics who could not afford to replace batteries routinely performed electrolyte reconditioning using Epsom salt solutions mixed in their own garages. Automotive trade journals from 1931 and 1934 published detailed instructions for the process. Popular Mechanics ran a feature on battery desulfation using mineral salts in 1937, describing it as a practical and proven method for extending battery life indefinitely. Then the war came, and everything changed. Before I go further, let me explain exactly what is happening inside a dying battery. Because once you understand the chemistry, you will never look at a dead battery the same way again. A healthy lead-acid battery contains 2 lead plates submerged in electrolyte, a mixture of sulfuric acid and distilled water. When the battery discharges, a chemical reaction occurs. Lead dioxide on the positive plate and sponge lead on the negative plate both react with the sulfuric acid to produce lead sulfate and release electrical energy. When you recharge the battery, that reaction reverses. The lead sulfate converts back into lead and sulfuric acid, and the battery is ready to discharge again. The problem is that this cycle is never perfectly efficient. With every charge and discharge, a small percentage of the lead sulfate crystals do not fully reconvert. They remain on the plates and gradually harden into a dense, non-reactive, crystalline structure. Over months and years, these hardened sulfate deposits accumulate until they cover enough of the plate surface that the battery can no longer hold a meaningful charge. This is sulfation, and it accounts for roughly 80% of all lead-acid battery failures worldwide. Here is where magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt, enters the chemistry. When you dissolve Epsom salt in distilled water and introduce it carefully into a sulfated battery's electrolyte, the magnesium ions interact with the hardened lead sulfate crystals on the plates. The magnesium sulfate solution acts as a mild chemical desulfating agent, breaking down the crystalline structure of the hardened deposits and returning them to a soluble form that can participate in the normal charge-discharge reaction. Simultaneously, the sulfate ions from the Epsom salt replenish electrolyte concentration that has been depleted by the sulfation process itself. A sulfated battery typically has lower acid concentration than a healthy battery, because sulfate ions have been locked up in the crystalline deposits on the plates. The Epsom salt treatment addresses both problems simultaneously, dissolving the deposits and restoring electrolyte balance. The result is a battery that can once again accept a full charge, hold that charge, and deliver full cranking amperage, often indistinguishable from a new battery. A 2003 study published in the Journal of Power Sources documented that magnesium sulfate electrolyte conditioning restored between 60% and 95% of original capacity in sulfated lead-acid batteries, depending on the severity of sulfation and the age of the battery. A 2011 independent study conducted by a team of electrical engineers at the University of Idaho confirmed similar results, noting that batteries treated with Epsom salt desulfation showed significantly extended service life compared to untreated control batteries. The chemistry is not controversial. It is not disputed. It is simply invisible, buried under marketing budgets and the quiet economic logic of planned obsolescence. In 1939, the world went to war, and dead batteries became a military emergency. Field radios in the European theatre failed in freezing temperatures as battery electrolyte froze and sulfation accelerated. Jeep batteries in the Pacific corroded in tropical humidity and lost capacity within weeks of deployment. Submarine battery banks, the most critical power systems on any vessel, required constant maintenance to remain operational during extended patrols. The War Department launched an emergency battery maintenance program in 1942. Military engineers at depots across 3 continents were issued field manuals describing electrolyte reconditioning procedures using mineral salt solutions. The manuals were practical, direct, and brutally effective. A dead battery in a combat zone was not a reason to requisition a new one. It was a problem to solve with whatever chemistry was available.